This lecture goes along with the discussion we've been having this week on horticulture. So today we're going to visit a little island in Polynesia called Rapa, which isn't too far from Papua New Guinea, which is where the culture that you saw in the video is from. So first off, let me take you to this small island. So like I said, it's an island located in Polynesia. Let me give you some context here. So there you see the US, you see Polynesia, and we're going to be zooming in even more so. So we've got Tahiti here, and that's pretty close to where we're going. So zooming in, here is little old Rapa. Here's Tahiti, like I was talking about. So there's Rapa, there's where we're going. And here's what it looks like from a bird's eye view. So it's a pretty small island. Its area is about a little larger than Rhode Island. It has some seasonal variation, so it's below the Tropic of Cancer, which means it gets kind of cold in the winter. It's not like a tropical island like you'd expect from Hawaii. It's a little colder. Some of the things you see here are going to look more like where you live or where I live here in Kansas. So the minimum temperature usually is around 48 degrees with a max being 88. I know that doesn't sound so bad, but it's a little bit cooler than other islands. It's got pretty heavy rainfall. Maybe you can tell, but it's pretty rocky. These are kind of some mountainous areas over here. So it lacks lush vegetation. It lacks beaches. It doesn't really have those sandy beaches that you would expect from a fun island like that, more cliff-like. So it's got mountains, cliffs, barren hillsides, and it doesn't have what you might expect from a tropical island, like no mangoes, no papaya, no pineapples. But with that being said, it's still an island in Polynesia, so it's going to look like an island as you expect. So it's a mouth of a dormant volcano. Maybe you can tell that. So that's where it gets its circular shape from. And like I was saying earlier, seasonal variation in climate, not hot all the time like we would expect. And like we were saying too, rocky and mountainous. Look at all those ridges there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Rapan history. Ancient inhabitants of Rapa actually lived up in those mountainous regions that we could see from that map. And they lived way up top. You'd expect people to live near the beaches, near the water where there is food availability and to travel. But they lived up there. And what you see is that there was chronic warfare among the individuals living there. The reason was is that there's population pressure. There's a lot of people on a small area of land, and so there was competition for land usage because, like we said, they're horticulturalists, or as we will see, they're horticulturalists, so they all needed land to grow their crops. And so what people did is that they would ally themselves with chiefs, and they would be with those chiefs and fight for those chiefs, and then they would live in these fortified hilltops fighting one another. But if you have an issue with your population being too high, what a lot of indigenous people found is that Europeans could solve that problem, but maybe not in the best way possible. Europeans found them in 1791, and so the first people to really come to them were British Protestant missionaries. And the Rapans, as we're going to talk about later, were actually really receptive to Protestantism, but they were also really receptive to the diseases they brought too. So they lost 90% of their population in 20 years after the missionaries came. And in the long run, even though the British Protestant missionaries were the first ones to come to them, they were actually forced to become a French possession. The French actually wanted to have ports in that neck of the woods so it could, after the completion of the Panama Canal, so it wanted a place that it could stop in that Polynesian area to fuel up as it was going through there. And so Rapa really didn't become much for the French because it's so small, so out of the way. Tahiti actually became more important to the French. So it has become more of a lonely island, not a lot of importance, even though it still belongs to the French. So let's talk about what the Rapans look like. The account I'm going to give you comes from an anthropologist who actually was teaching up at KU before he retired a couple years ago, named Dr. Alan Hansen, and he spent a few years with the Rapans in the 60s. So this is his description of them, or his account of them. So what they have is a subsistence economy, which, as you read this week with horticulture, that's pretty common. And so they are horticulturalists, and their staple crop is taro, which is a root that you can grow in water gardens. And if I have time, I'm going to post a video of a Dirty Jobs clip where Mike Rowe goes to a taro farm in Hawaii so you can get a better idea of what it is. But the staple crop taro, like I said, is a root. And the interesting thing about it is that it's actually um, poisonous if you eat it raw. And so you have to make sure it's cooked. And what the Rapins do is they cook it and they turn it into a paste called popoi. And so here in this picture to the right, you see women creating popoi. They cook and mash up the popoi and they're aerating it here on these rocks in the middle of a creek, of all things. And then after they've aerated it, they're going to put it in these banana leaves that this woman has waiting for it, and it's going to ferment. And then after a couple days, they're going to eat it. Dr. Hansen said it kind of tasted like orange beer. So if you can imagine, that's their staple food that they eat at all meals. But some other foods, notice they have watermelon, tomatoes, oranges, bananas, radishes, lettuce, some of the things that we can grow here in Kansas if you're from Kansas. But they also have fish, which makes sense because they're an island. They raise some goats and cattle. They don't work real hard at it. They kind of let them free range up in the mountains and bring them down when they need meat. Another thing that they've gotten into is selling coffee. So they'll grow coffee and then sell it to make some money. Because even in the 60s when Dr. Hansen was there, they had a little store that the French had set up where they could buy things that they might need. So here's an example of a man in his taro garden. So these are the leaves of the taro, and you pick up the root and you're going to eat the starchy root of this plant. And you can actually cut off the root and then replant it. So it's actually quite sustainable if you think about horticulture practices. And they say you know a Rapin because he's usually got mud up to his knees, which you can see here, and he smells like smoke, which is something I will explain here in a minute. So obviously he's living up to that Rapin lifestyle or stereotype. So the division of labor with the Rapins, men typically are the ones out cultivating the taro and other crops in the garden. They're the ones fishing, building houses, boats, canoes. Women are the ones doing the household tasks. They're the ones that prepare the popoi, like you saw in the photo, in charge of childcare. But they also help with agricultural labor, especially when it comes to coffee. Everybody wants to help because that means money for you as well if you help. So, to give you kind of an idea of some of the technology they have under infrastructure, I wanted to show you a picture that has kind of different elements and different variations of housing. So, originally, housing for the Rapins involved pandanus roofs but now they're kind of moving to iron roofs, and you can also see concrete homes. So you see more of the traditional here, but also see elements of modernization creeping into this as well. And you can see cement is there too, and you have to imagine that they have to get goods from Tahiti, which really isn't that close. So if you're going to build a home like this, it's going to take a little longer. But their churches, which I told you earlier that they embrace Christianity pretty enthusiastically, they always have very modern looking churches because that is a very important aspect of their life. All right, social structure. So getting to their social relations. There are only two villages on this island, if you can imagine, both in the mouth of that volcano that I was telling you about and across the bay from one another. So you've got the small town, Area, and then you've got the big town, Haure. And then you can just a little show you on this picture, you can see their taro gardens here, their little terraced. All right, so with these two villages, you've got Area, which is the smaller one, and they say that with Area, it's kind of like small town America. There's cooperation among households, there's solidarity. If they go fishing, they share it with everyone. But Haure, the H one, is more of a big city, if you will, like we know here. It's a little bit larger, so your relationships are more limited to your close kinsmen, your neighbors. And when they go fishing, they will share it with just the close relatives or maybe a couple neighbors, but they don't share everything because they're too large to do that. But those villages work together. They go to church together every once in a while and have friendly competition as well. They do have a district council, kind of I mean, they're elected officials, but they don't have a lot of power. They act more for the liaison for Rapa, who talks to the administrator or the official who's appointed by the governor of French Polynesia. So they are the ones that kind of talk to the higher ups when they need something. But they're looked upon pretty negatively by the Rapans because they know that elected officials are probably going to do more to help their friends and family, more so than the Rapans as a whole. And kind of interesting, they used to have chiefs, but not necessarily anymore. But notice how they keep the same title of chief there, even though it doesn't mean the same thing as it did when they were had chronic warfare, like we talked about earlier. But the district council, they don't have a ton of power. They can mediate disputes, they can represent community interests, but other than that, not very much going on. For Rapans, they consider a household those individuals who habitually eat together. And I always ask this of my face to face classes: if a household is considered those who habitually eat together, how many of you actually would say you live with your parents if you do live with your parents? Because I don't know about you, but when I was in high school or even college, I didn't really eat with my parents, so I wouldn't necessarily be considered of their household because we tend to think if you sleep there, then that must be your household. But notice the difference here. You just have to eat together. And they have pretty large households because they have extended family members, so people will come to their cookhouses and it can get pretty big, even though you might not sleep in the same house. Something interesting that they have are called romages, and it's just the name of their descent groups. Because back in 1889, after Rapa had lost so much of their population, they ended up distributing land on the island to individual owners. It doesn't look exactly like this. This is just kind of a visual. So each owner got a piece of land. And so now Rapans today can trace their ancestry or their roots back to these people. So someone can say, well, my uncle Bob, he was given this section in 1889, and so I know that this is a part of my family. And with Ramages, the most important part is that they do own land in common, so you can work together and you can count on them to help you if you need help working your coffee fields or your taro fields. And a lot of Rapans, because the population is so small, or I should say all Rapans, belong to two or more. And it was even to the point when Dr. Hansen was there in the 1960s that the majority of Rapans belonged to every Ramage because they could trace some form of descent because the population is so small, which brings up other interesting things that we'll talk about here later as well. But they own and work the land communally, so it's just a way to notice those that you can count on to help with cultivating land. One practice that the Rapans do is called fosterage. It's basically like we would think of fostering children. But it's interesting for why they do it. It's really important for Rapan adults to have children. And one of those reasons is because your children will take care of you when you get old. They don't have nursing homes, so you have to count on your kids that they're going to take care of you when you get old. And it's kind of tit for tat because if you raise them and take care of them, they will take care of you in your old age. Well, if you're getting to the point where you're getting older, you don't have any kids, what are you going to do? Well, you take in a family member's kid. And this actually works out well because in Rapa, they have a lot more children than they intend to. The ideal number Dr. Hansen found was like 2 or 3, but most of the Rapan women were having about 6 kids. And Dr. Hansen pointed out this was because that their ideas of when you can get pregnant don't really coincide with the science of when a woman is more fertile. And so they have all these children. Interesting thing is when he went back in 2003, they didn't have this issue anymore because they were taking birth control pills. But back in the 60s, they didn't have that. And so you had women having a lot of kids. Another funny thing is that Dr. Hansen tried to tell them how to be more careful, if you will, in having fewer children. And they didn't take him very seriously after his wife became pregnant when they were living on that island studying the Rapans. So, anyways, I digress, but they have more children than they mean to. So, what they do is these childless adults will take children off their family members' hands. But the children get to decide who they go with. So they will try really hard to attract these kids to come live with them and like bring balloons and things like that. And it's not like the kids don't know who their parents are. It just means that these kids are going to go live and be fed by different adults than their parents. And since they were supported by those parents or their adoptive parents, if you will, their foster parents, then they'll take care of them in old age. All right, their practices of marriage are pretty interesting because Polynesian cultures are kind of known for being a little loosey goosey when it comes to sexual activity. They're not very restrictive to their kids, but that comes into great contradiction to this belief in Protestantism because they're devout Protestants who preach no sex before marriage. So, what are the Rapins to do? Well, what you see is that they will have those more loose guidelines, but you have to kind of sneak around. The teenagers are sneaking around. They are having sexual activity, but hoping no one will find out. But after a while, people will find out if someone gets pregnant. And so, if a couple does get pregnant, they'll stay together and help raise that kid, but they don't necessarily get married at that point. But you're expected to eventually get married, and maybe you'll have a couple kids and then eventually get married. And we'll talk about why here in a minute, why they might be a little bit reticent to get married. But if you take too long, the church is going to get involved, and they call that a pilgrimage marriage. So there may be a point where you're sleeping and you wake up and find some of the most important church members surrounding your bed, and they're going to say, "Please pray with us." And that's code for you better be getting married pretty darn soon because we've looked past what you've been doing for a while, but it's time. Another interesting practice here in Rapa is that they practice sororate and levirate marriage. And what that means is that if your brother's significant other, or I should say, if your brother dies or your sister dies, you may be called upon to marry their spouse. And you see this in a lot of cultures actually, because it's just a way to make sure that person's taken care of, or if that marriage forms some form of alliance, it's not going to be broken by the death of a spouse. And it makes sense, at least in this Robin culture. It's really interesting when you read Dr. Hanson's book because he talks about how brothers and sisters aren't really allowed to be left alone in a bedroom or talk about anything sexual in nature. And it kind of makes sense because their population's pretty small, so you don't want to put the temptation there for brothers or sisters. But when it comes to brother in laws and sisters in laws, they're allowed to have a joking relationship, talk about things sexual in nature, or joke about it. But when you think about it, it makes sense because they may eventually have to marry one another should their spouse die. And it's not that they're forced into it, it's just that if you are single and available and your brother or sister dies and you're available to marry their spouse, you're there. So here is one of those reasons why the Roffins smell like smoke. They have these cookhouses, or they did in the 60s at least, where they'd have the fire over here and the doorway all the way over here. So there was lots of smoke going on. And like I said just a minute ago, the household is whoever eats together. Well, there's a lot of people here eating. Here's Dr. Hanson. You can tell he's the anthropologist eating out of a can. You've got the po' poi in the center. They're eating that as well. Robins have an interesting way of thinking about how individuals pass through life. And to pass through different stages of life, you have to show that you are ready or maybe already there by how you act and how you think, which is pretty different from our culture where we base it on age. You've reached 18, you're an adult, you've reached 21, I guess you're more of an adult because you can drink now. All these rites of passage come with age, but different for Rapa because you have to show that you act and think that way. So infants are pretty easy, you're a baby. When you learn to walk, though, they say you move into childhood. So children in this culture are thought as kind of incomplete beings because they don't have a lot of knowledge yet. They're very innocent. They don't do anything economically to contribute to the family. They're pure individuals. And so they're learning, they're going to school, they're expected to do very little. And you can tell this by where they sit in church, because in church, the kids, the children, sit up front and they're allowed to sit by girls next to boys, so mixed sexes, which changes as they get older. The next step is youth. And the Robins say that when they begin to lie to you, that's when a child has moved to a youth. And the youth are the ones that are having the most fun at night, but they're also the ones working the hardest during the day. So their lives are oriented towards pleasure. They're dancing, drinking, having sexual adventures because they're teenagers. But during the day, like I said, they're doing a lot in the economy. They're doing the heavy tasks. They're rowing, carrying heavy loads, making po poi. They're working hard. But everyone's fully aware of what they're doing at night. And so at church, this is most symbolized by where they sit. They sit in the very back of the church. They have to sit separated by sex, so females with females, males to males, and they're not allowed to take communion because everybody knows what they're doing. Last one is adulthood. And the way you become an adult is you get married. And so that's one of the reasons we see that the Rapins put marriage off for so long, because you're publicly committing yourself to a lifetime of responsibility to your spouse and to your children. When you're a youth, you're a workhorse and you're having a lot of fun. So, first thing, of course, they don't want to leave that fun, carefree life behind. But also, kind of on a more responsible run, is that you're doing a lot of work, and oftentimes you're doing a lot of work for your family, your extended family. And so when you get married, your primary interest and the most important thing to you is your now nuclear family. And people are hesitant to move to adulthood because they're going to miss out on those fun times, but also they feel bad not helping out with the family that they've been growing up with. And when you become an adult, your place in church changes a little. You still have to be separated by female and males because they still know what you're doing at home. Um, but you can start taking communion again because you're married. You joined and committed yourself to the church and family. So here's some kids playing around. There's some girls. Um, I don't know if you can tell, but they're pretending like they're making po poi. Having a good time. Here's some kids taking a bath, not having as much fun of the time. Okay, let's talk about their superstructure. So their worldview, religion. So I was telling you guys that Protestantism, it's really important in their life. They really embraced it when the missionaries came. And it's a really important part of their life all week long, all year long. They have no fewer than 11 church functions per week. 11 per week. So they spend a lot of time at church. Bible discussion is a really important part of an adult's life. It's kind of their time to show off their ability to lead a group, to discuss the Bible, passages of it, and kind of be an individual and show their opinions about something. They can practice their oratory skills. It actually promotes harmony between the two villages, too. There's a single council that oversees both parishes, so both parishes, one in each village. And they take communion together every month just so they can bring themselves together. And they meet for worship on minor holidays. So if you can't get across the bay or you don't do it regularly, church kind of does it for you. I want to talk about their land beliefs because it really is different from how most Americans view land. So they talk about the difference between an improvement and a territory. So here's our map again. A territory is just a concept of a location, some named portion of land. So there's little territories all over this island. But an improvement to the Rapins is, what it sounds like. It's improving the land. It could be a garden, it could be planting a tree, building a house. But the interesting thing with the Rapins is that anybody can make an improvement on any unused territory. You don't have to ask permission. So, we are talking about Bob's part of the island. Maybe if that's not even like the closest tie I have, if there's a piece of land that's empty, I could just go build a garden if I wanted to. And that garden doesn't become his or his family's because that's their part of the island. It's still mine. And they don't really care that I did that. And the reason why is that land to the Rapins has sentimental value. It doesn't have a monetary value like we think of it. I wouldn't want someone coming onto my land and putting a garden there. I wouldn't be too happy. But that's because it's my land, right? And I have a different idea of what that land is. It has worth to me. And so the land to them, like I said, it's a sentimental value. It shows where your family came from. That's why it's sentimental. It's your link with your ancestors. It shows the place in your world. Another thing that we talk about with the Rapins is the concept of ha'ama, which is an intensely uncomfortable state. The Rapins divide people into 5 different groups: strangers, neighbors, lovers, kinsmen, and friends. Those are their 5 groups: strangers, neighbors, lovers, kinsmen, and friends. And so they have all those 5. And one of the reasons why strangers make them uncomfortable is because they have no map of a stranger. They're unpredictable, and you don't really know what they're going to do or what they're going to say or what you should do and say. And you have to think they haven't had a good field or track record with strangers. And being on such a small island, they probably don't see a lot of people that they don't know either. So they just get uncomfortable around people they don't know. For example, Dr. Hansen talked about how he was going door to door doing interviews when he was studying them, and that he knocked on a door one day and watched an old lady flee out the back of her house so she wouldn't have to talk to him because, it's uncomfortable. Here's someone you don't know trying to ask you about your life. So, the last thing I'll leave you with is one of my favorite pictures from Rapa. This is inside the church. So, notice you've got the kids sitting in front, you've got the adults and the youth sitting in back, and this guy is going around poking them and making sure they stay awake during the church service. So, hopefully, you were poked awake and stayed awake for this lecture here. All right, thanks, guys.